Hello, I'm Sarah Waters and I'm here with Owen Barfield, who's here to talk to us about his grandfather, also Owen Barfield, who was one of the Inklings along with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. He lives in Oxfordshire and is the literary trustee of the Owen Barfield estate. And he makes Barfield's works more widely available and publishes some of them as well. And you can read more about that on owenbarfield.org. And he's here to tell us that he's keen that we know that Barfield's work are not difficult, they just need a slight shift in consciousness. Why is Owen Barfield known as the first and last Inkling?
Well, Owen was the one to bring the Inkling impulse into the group through his interest in music, dance and humour. He was also the first to be published with his book The Silver Trumpet, which was a fairy tale published in 1925. And also Owen, by using that phrase, which he happily applied to himself, is creating a link to St. John's Gospel where that phrase appears. And he identifies strongly with St. John's Gospel, and if you like, in a sense, he is the St. John of the group.
Why is Owen Barfield known for his teaching on the evolution of consciousness?
Owen's main theme was the evolution of consciousness, and that's why he's known for teaching about it. Owen's take on it is through language, particularly the use and the history of language.
How did Owen Barfield influence his fellow Inklings?
Owen was very much against positivism, which was the word that they used to describe a kind of reductive materialism which was prevalent at the time and continues to be prevalent. So his theme is anti-positivism. And it's this idea, this philosophy of being anti-positivist that he brought into the Inkling group and which he shares with his fellow Inklings. Owen coined a phrase, if you like, which is that we are currently in our society dealing with the unresolved residue of positivism. So the effect of going down a positivist or a materialist path has created a certain set of circumstances which we are now having to deal with. And he explained this to his fellow Inklings. His fellow Inklings lived this with him, and they were all fighting this battle. But Owen was the champion, if you like, that called it out, named it and explained it. Also, Owen was the one who provided proof of concept. So, for example, in his fairy tale book, The Silver Trumpet, he's explaining how a children's fairy tale can be used to explain and to communicate deep philosophical truths. And Tolkien in particular was very much taken by this way of explaining truth and used it himself later. In fact, to really understand what the Inklings were saying, you would need to understand Owen's work as well in the context of how they were all communicating.
How did Owen Barfield's philosophy develop?
Well, it came to him gradually, but it came to him organically. So Owen was aged about 15 at Highgate School, and he was sat next to his best friend in the classics Latin class. His friend, who was Cecil Harwood, translated a phrase, and that phrase was death, but it was translated literally as to walk out of life. And Owen, from that moment on, saw that language can communicate a way of thinking that is evolved. And so you have the beginnings of an understanding of the evolution of consciousness. Later on, Owen was in the First World War, and as an officer in the First World War, he was working in the engineering corps. And there in particular, he was studying wireless and wireless communications, and that gave him exposure to electricity and the concepts of polarity, which were very important to him, along with his own poetry and his interest in Coleridge, which all worked up towards a philosophy that was coherent, which he explained for the rest of his life. Now, Owen is known for a couple of phrases. One is original participation, and another one is final participation. And in a diagram that we can see, there's this U shape with a turning point in time, where humanity is descending from a condition of original participation and is moving toward a condition of final participation. This diagram you can see on the website for the Owen Barfield Literary Estate. There's a lot more to it, but you can see that in this diagram the philosophy of Owen is in some ways represented.
What is Anthroposophy, and how does it influence other Inklings?
Anthroposophy was a philosophy, an idea that was started by Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian teacher, seer, mystic. Literally, it's divine wisdom in humanity. But the definition that Steiner liked and the way it resonated with Owen is to say that it's a study of the consciousness of one's human nature. And because it's a study of consciousness, this is where it overlaps greatly with Owen's philosophy. In fact, Owen often referred to and deferred to Steiner, and the two men did meet in London on a couple of occasions when Steiner was giving a talk in London. Through Owen, the other Inklings were then exposed to Anthroposophy, particularly Charles Williams, who would have attended some of those talks in London as well, not with Steiner, but the ones that were given through the Anthroposophical Society. And on many occasions, Owen would have had a chance to express these anthroposophical ideas to his fellow Inklings. In fact, people who know Anthroposophy and then have studied Tolkien see clear parallels between the two and think there must be a link. The link there is through Owen. And in some ways, my feeling is that those other Inkling authors were in some ways preparing their readership for some of the concepts that are within Anthroposophy. Now, Anthroposophy is a spiritual science, and at the time they were writing, maybe not everybody would have been open to the understanding of that spiritual science. But by practicing a sort of fantasy writing, they're starting to exercise their imagination and some of those kind of internal muscles that will be required in order to move forward and have a greater understanding in the future. That future is now.
What do you think Owen Barfield would be saying now about our current times?
Well, I think it would be very reserved to say anything at all. He did stress to me that he was a Victorian. He was born in the Victorian period and he had Victorian values. So he would feel uncomfortable having to talk about now because he was not a person of the now. But he was a person of the 1920s and 1930s, and he had a deep knowledge of that in a way that we've kind of lost our knowledge now, the 1920s and 30s. But he lived them very, very in a very awareful way. And I think what he's saying about those times can be applied to these times. In fact, it's even more relevant. And Owen knew that he was writing for a future audience. In fact, he said that his general readership won't really be open to understanding what he was saying until the mid-2030s. So we're still not even there. But more and more people are starting to think and be aware of the kind of issues that he was describing. And particularly I've seen that in the last 15 years or so, there has been more awareness of spiritual matters, more clairvoyance in particular high clairvoyant people. These are things that just didn't happen 30, 40 years ago when Owen was writing. But I think he could foresee that it would be happening. And in that sense, his writings is the most relevant of all the Inklings.
Why was imagination so important to Owen Barfield?
For Owen, the imagination was a spiritual tool. That's different to C.S. Lewis. So for C.S. Lewis, the meaning of imagination, the use of imagination, was one of the key points of their disagreements, the disagreement which they called the Great War, and which they had to put aside because they couldn't come to an agreement on it. So I would just say that for C.S. Lewis, imagination was very important, but it was a sort of something to be both played with, but also to be set apart and to be admired. But for Owen, imagination was an integral part of the human being. It was a spiritual tool which allowed humanity to move forward in its spiritual understanding. And imagination is part of a set of three. And I like to describe this set of three as starting with intuition. Now, some people struggle with imagination. They might even say they haven't got an imagination, but most people have a feeling for intuition. They kind of know what you mean when you have a sense of intuition. And they feel the intuition from within them going outwards, and they know what intuition is. But if we start with intuition, then you have inspiration, which is a sense of something coming from outside you and hitting you. And then you have imagination as a third stage, which again is within you but going out. And you start to build up this rhythmic process, a bit like breathing, inwards, outwards, inwards, outwards. Now this is core to how Grandfather saw about it, and this is a core spiritual exercise for Grandfather. And in fact, in the way of these spiritual exercises, you can turn that around. So you can start with imagination, then move on to inspiration, and then move on to intuition. So there's a kind of mirror reflection of them. But I'd like to explain it the first way, because I think that's where Owen would feel we can engage with that ourselves.
What is Owen Barfield's relevance now?
Well, back to that term, the unresolved residue of positivism. We are still living with that unresolved residue. And many of the messes and the problems that humanity finds themselves in is because we have not addressed that. We are still living in a reductive materialist system. So it's even more relevant now to call it out, to identify it, and to go back and try and correct it. So the relevance, even more so now, is to know that we are on a path that has taken us down into many dead ends. To call that out, Grandfather said, was the great taboo. But taboos all over the place are being broken. But we still haven't got to a position of breaking this taboo, which is maybe why he says it won't be until the 2030s that we can actually talk about these things, because this is the last great taboo, that we live in a sort of false scenario which doesn't recognize the spiritual world, and because of that, we are storing up problems for ourselves. There is a battle to be won, and I think Owen, in his own life and now afterwards, is calling us to that battle, to fight the good fight, if you like, to recognize that there is evil and to try to confront that where we can. One of the senior Catholic theologians that I was listening to recently even went as far as saying that Owen's theology or philosophy was really the only way forward for Christianity today.
Which text would you recommend people start getting acquainted with if they want to know more about Owen Barfield?
Well, Owen wrote 99 essays. I counted them up recently and was struck by that number because he lived to be 99, and so it seems like a convenient number, but that's how many I've counted and that are available of his to read. And each essay is quite self-enclosed, quite compact, and a good place to start. When I asked him that question when I was 17, he said that the book I should read is Saving the Appearances. And of course, Saving the Appearances is his key book where his philosophy is best laid out. But the place that I started is with his novellas. So I started with Eager Spring, which he wrote in the 1980s and finished off in the 1990s. And it's a sort of contemporary novel dealing with ecological disaster. So it's quite contemporary. It's not a great piece of literature, but it's a good way into his kind of way of thinking. An early novel of his written in the 1920s, a novella, is Rose on the Ash Heap. And then there's a little novella called Night Operation. These three novellas are very gentle and easy ways into his work. The thing about Owen's work is he always tried to say the same thing and was looking for different ways of saying it. So wherever you start with Owen's work, you're going to the same destination, and it's a question of just starting and finding your comfort place within that. But there's many long poems, short poems, plays, all sorts of material to engage with.